Didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I just stood there in my own driveway, holding a cardboard box with my name written on it in my daughter's handwriting, and I understood exactly what was happening. Let me back up. I spent 37 years as a licensed structural engineer in the state of Ohio. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that gets you on the news or earns you a corner office with a view. But it was honest. Every bridge I certified, every retaining wall I signed off on, every load-bearing calculation I ran through at 2 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee on my desk, all of it was done right. Because when you do my kind of work, close enough gets people killed. That's a standard you carry in your bones after long enough. You stop being able to tolerate anything that isn't true. My wife, Sandra, passed 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And she fought every single one of those months with a grace I still don't have words for. After she was gone, the house felt like a building with a compromised foundation. Still standing, just not safe, the way it used to be. My daughter, the younger of my 2 children, came back from Seattle about 2 years after her mother died. She'd been out there trying to make a go of it in marketing, and it hadn't worked out the way she'd planned. She needed somewhere to land. I had the space. It made sense. Her name is Audrey. She was 31 when she moved back in. I want to be clear about something because it matters for everything that comes after. I was glad to have her. The house had been quiet for a long time, and there's a specific kind of quiet that stops being peaceful and starts being something else entirely. Having her back helped with that. We'd eat dinner together. She'd sometimes sit with me in the garage while I worked on the old Buick I'd been restoring since my retirement. We weren't close the way Sandra and I had been close, but we were family. I thought we understood each other. The man she started seeing about 8 months after moving in. His name was Derek, and I want you to understand that is exactly the kind of name that fit him perfectly. Pressed khakis. Firm handshake. Smile that arrived about a half-second too fast. He worked in commercial real estate, which I later came to understand meant he was very good at making things that weren't worth much look like they were worth emetry. I want to be honest about that because I've had people tell me I was looking for reasons, that I was protective of Audrey in an unhealthy way, that I never gave him a fair chance. But here's what I know. I have spent nearly 4 decades evaluating structures for hidden stress. I know how to look at something and find where it's going to fail. And when I looked at Derek, I saw a man who was performing the role of a good person rather than being one. There's a difference. It's subtle, but it's there. I kept my mouth shut. That's what you do. She was 33 years old. She didn't need her father telling her who to love. They got engaged on New Year's Eve 2 years after she'd come back home. She showed me the ring at breakfast the next morning. It was large, conspicuously large. The kind of ring that costs more than a man in commercial real estate should be spending when he's told you twice that things have been a little slow in the market lately. I congratulated her. I meant it. I genuinely wanted her to be happy. What I didn't know then, what I would spend the next 18 months slowly, painfully understanding, was that Derek had looked at me and seen something very specific. He hadn't seen a father. He hadn't seen a retired engineer. He had seen a 64-year-old widower who owned a home outright, had a pension, had a 401k, that Sandra and I had spent 30 years building carefully, and who loved his daughter enough to do just about anything she asked. He had seen a resource. The first ask was small. Audrey came to me in March, about 3 months after the engagement, and said Derek had found a property, a small commercial building in Dayton, that was basically a guaranteed return. He just needed someone to co-sign a short-term loan because his business credit was tied up in another deal. $40,000. She said it like she was asking to borrow my truck for the weekend. Casual. The way you talk about something when you've rehearsed it enough times that it's supposed to sound unrehearsed. Feel that I'd think about it? What I actually did was call my oldest son, Roger, who lives in Pittsburgh with his wife and their 3 kids. Roger is careful with money in the way that people who grew up watching their parents be careful with money tend to be. He didn't say much when I told him. He just said, Dad, don't co-sign anything. I already knew that. I needed to hear someone else say it. I told Audrey no. She was quiet about it. Polite even, but something shifted between us after that. Small and barely perceptible, like a hairline crack. You can only see if the light hits it exactly right. The wedding was planned for October. A venue outside Columbus, a converted farmhouse with a barn and string lights, and all of it. Sandra would have loved it. That thought landed on me harder than I expected every time it came up, and it came up often. I was paying for a portion of the wedding, not all of it. Derek's parents were contributing as well, and the two of them were covering some costs themselves. But I had committed to $30,000 back when Audrey first started planning. It was the right thing to do. It was what her mother would have wanted. About 6 weeks before the wedding, Audrey sat down with me at the kitchen table one evening and said there was something she needed to talk to me about. Her voice had a specific quality to it, measured, like she'd been practicing. She told me that she and Derek had been thinking about the future, about what made sense long-term. She said the house, my house, the one Sandra and I bought in 1987, the one where both my children grew up, the one I'd spent 37 years paying off, was too big for just me. She said it wasn't practical. She said Derek had connections in property management and could help me find something more suitable, something smaller. And then she said that she and Derek had talked to a lawyer about the possibility of me transferring the house into a family trust. I remembered the sound the refrigerator made in the silence after she said that. I remember the way the overhead light caught the grain of the kitchen table. I remember thinking, with the part of my brain that never stops running calculations, this is not a conversation she decided to have. This is a conversation she was sent to have. I didn't react. I've been asked how I managed that, and I don't have a clean answer. I think it's because the shock was so total that it actually moved past shock into something else, a kind of stillness, the same stillness I feel when I'm looking at a structural report and I realize the problem is worse than anyone thought. You don't panic, you start measuring. I told her I'd look into it. That same week, I called a friend of mine, a man named Gerald, who had been my college roommate 40 years ago and went on to become an estate attorney in Cincinnati. I told Gerald everything, the cosign request, the family trust, the timing. I asked him what he thought. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need to talk to your own attorney, not mine. Someone who has no connection to anyone in your family, this week." I did. Her name was Patricia Owens, and she had 22 years of experience in estate law and asset protection. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon and laid it all out, and I watched her face carefully as I talked. She didn't react dramatically. Estate lawyers who've been doing this long enough have seen most things, but at the end, she folded her hands on a desk and told me, quietly and without softening it, that the pattern I was describing was consistent with something she saw with some regularity in her practice. Adult children, sometimes with the involvement of a new partner, sometimes on their own, who began positioning themselves to gain control of an elderly parent's assets. She said the word elderly with such professional neutrality that I almost didn't register it. I was 64 years old. I drove myself to that appointment. I still ran 3 miles twice a week, but she was right, technically, and what she said next was more important than how she said it. She told me to do nothing that changed the legal status of any of my assets. She told me to document every conversation. She told me to start keeping a written record, dates, what was said, who was present. And she told me to revise my will. I went home and I started writing things down. Over the next 5 weeks, I learned more than I wanted to know. I found out, through a conversation I was not meant to overhear, that Derek had already shown the house to someone, not as a listing, as a prospective asset. I didn't have the specifics, and I didn't have the specifics, and I didn't let on that I'd heard anything. I found paperwork in the recycling. Audrey had always been careless about the recycling, even as a teenager, that referenced a trust document with my name on it. A draft. I photographed it with my phone. I found that a life insurance policy Sandra and I had taken out together, which listed the children as equal beneficiaries, had been inquired about. Someone had called the insurance company asking about the process for updating a beneficiary designation. The company had sent a letter confirming that no changes had been made, which they were required to do. The letter came to my address. If it had gone anywhere else, I might never have known. I brought all of this to Patricia Owens. She updated my will. She helped me establish a revocable living trust, a real one, in my name, managed by me, with Roger listed as successor trustee. She put explicit protective language in place. She also pointed me toward a financial advisor who helped me restructure certain accounts in ways that made them considerably harder to access without my active, in-person authorization. Then I waited. The wedding was 3 weeks out. I was still planning to go. I was still listed as the father of the bride. I was still writing a check for $30,000 in wedding costs, which, I want to be transparent about this, I went back and forth on. Patricia advised me that withdrawing financial support suddenly might create conflict before I was ready for it. I agreed. I kept my commitments. I wrote the check. 2 weeks before the wedding, Audrey came to me again. This time, Derek was with her. They sat across from me at the same kitchen table, and Derek did most of the talking, which was a shift from before. He had a folder with him. He slid it across the table. Inside was a version of the trust document I'd already seen in the recycling. Derek said it was a great opportunity to simplify my estate. He said it would protect the house from probate. He said he'd spoken with a lawyer, his lawyer, and it was all straightforward. He said all I needed to do was sign. I looked at the document. I looked at Derek. I looked at my daughter, who was looking at the table. I said, "I'll have my attorney review it." Derek's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. He said that should be fine, of course. No rush, just whenever I got around to it. He knew I wouldn't sign it. I think he knew right then that something had changed. But there was nothing he could do about it without showing his hand, and he wasn't ready to do that. The week before the wedding, I drove up to Pittsburgh and spent 3 days with Roger and his family. I told him everything. He sat across from me at his kitchen table. I've had a lot of significant conversations at kitchen tables, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dad, what do you want to do?" I told him. He nodded. He said, "Okay, I'm with you." I drove back home on a Thursday. The wedding was Saturday. I arrived at the venue that evening for the rehearsal dinner. I wore the suit Sandra had helped me pick out for her cousin's wedding 8 years ago. It still fit. She had good taste. The rehearsal dinner was held in a smaller room at the venue, round tables with white linen, candles. Derek's family at one end, mine at the other, and an assortment of friends filling in the middle. Roger had driven down from Pittsburgh and was seated beside me. He squeezed my shoulder when I sat down. Derek made a toast. He talked about family. He talked about building something lasting. He talked about how grateful he was to be joining our family and how much it meant to him. I watched Audrey's face as he spoke. I watched her, and I saw something there that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror for years after Sandra died. She loved him. She genuinely loved him. And he was using that. That was the hardest part of the whole evening. Not the anger, the grief. The next morning, I got dressed and drove to the venue. Ceremony was at 2. I arrived at 11 because Audrey had asked me to be there early for photographs. I found the venue coordinator, a pleasant woman who had been managing weddings at this property for over a decade, and I asked to speak with her privately. We stepped into a small office near the main entrance. I sat down across from her. I told her I needed to update the payment arrangement for the event. Specifically, I told her the $30,000 check I had written needed to be voided and that I would be replacing it with a cashier's check made out directly to the venue, with an explicit stipulation that any refund or cancellation credit could only be issued to me by name, at my verified address. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said she appreciated me clarifying that and that the original payment had indeed been received and that she would note the change in their records. I thanked her. I put a copy of a notarized letter from Patricia Owens on her desk, which formalized everything we had just discussed and which Patricia had prepared for this exact purpose. The coordinator read it, nodded, and filed it. Then I went and took photographs with my daughter. She was beautiful. I want to say that plainly because it's true and because it matters. Whatever else was happening. She was my daughter, And she was getting married, and she was beautiful. And I loved her in the uncomplicated way that doesn't go away no matter what else a person does. The ceremony was short, the vows were standard, the minister was kind. I walked Audrey down the aisle, and I sat in the front row, and I did not let my face show anything other than what a father's face is supposed to show at his daughter's wedding. During the reception, Derek pulled me aside near the bar. He was relaxed, 3 inches of bourbon relaxed. He told me he was glad we were officially family now. He said he was looking forward to working together on some things. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who has already decided how the story ends. I told him I had a gift for him. He laughed and said there was no need. They'd told everyone no gifts. I reached into my jacket pocket and handed him a sealed envelope. He looked at it. He looked at me. He started to open it, and I told him he might want to find somewhere private. He read what was inside in less than 3 minutes. I know because I watched the clock above the bar while I waited. What was inside was a letter from Patricia Owens on her firm's letterhead, addressed to Derek by full name, informing him that all of my assets, including my home, my retirement accounts, and my life insurance beneficiary designations, had been formally restructured with full legal documentation, and that any future legal action taken to contest this arrangement would be defended vigorously. The letter also noted, with careful professional language, that the draft trust document he had presented me with had been reviewed and found to contain several provisions that would be, in Patricia's assessment, of considerable interest to Ohio's Adult Protective Services if it were ever formally submitted. It did not threaten. It informed. There is a difference, and Patricia understood it. It also contained a separate document, a signed, notarized addendum to my will, in which I had reduced my daughter's inheritance to a specific dollar amount, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be a windfall, with the remainder going to Roger, and, in part, to a scholarship fund at my alma mater in Sandra's name. I wasn't doing it out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I was doing it because I had spent 37 years understanding that a structure which has been compromised has to be reinforced before it fails, not after. Derek came back to the reception floor about 15 minutes later. His color was different. The smooth confidence was still there, but it was working harder than it had been before. He didn't say anything to me the rest of the night. Audrey and I danced to a song her mother had loved, a slow Patsy Cline number. The DJ had been more than happy to accommodate. She rested her head on my shoulder the way she used to do when she was small. I held her carefully. The way you hold something you know is fragile. I don't know what Derek told her that night, or that week, or in the months that followed. I know that Audrey called me 6 weeks after the wedding, and the conversation was short and carefully worded in the way that conversations are when someone else is listening. I know that Roger flew down to see me that winter, and we sat in the garage and worked on the Buick together, not talking about any of it, just working. I know that 2 things can be true at the same time, that I love my daughter and that I could not let her be used as the instrument of my own ruin. I had looked at that structure. I had found the stress points. I had reinforced what needed reinforcing, and I had walked away from what could not be saved. At least not yet. At least not by me. Sometime, I think, the most important thing a man can do is simply refuse to fall.